All right, so welcome everyone to another guest presentation. So this time we're actually taking the opportunity to rebrand this series. So we are going to be calling these, what previously were called guest presentations, are going to be called the Wolfram Institute Seminar, because effectively this is what they were. And moving forward, we thought that we've now got enough of a track record and enough of an inertia into just running regular hosted talks that we should just brand it as for what it is. So welcome everyone to the first branded Wolfram Institute seminar. Of course, just as a note, you've been seeing this in the past. You can expect this in the future. The Wolfram Institute is a small research organization focusing on all manner of computational research in sort of more pure mathematics side, also sort of in many areas related to AI, anything to do with Stephen's research interests, and so on. So this seminar is an opportunity to connect to the broader world of research, so the big scientific community out there. And so since today we are kind of branding this for the first time, I just wanted to say a couple of words about this and the sort of reasoning behind it. Of course, our goal is to try and build as much of a community that connects with the contents of our research. So for that, we have our Discord server. So you are very welcome to follow all our updates on there. We also have a mailing list for the important announcements. And you can expect in the months to come that this space, this YouTube channel, roughly around similar times and typically in some middle days of the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, typically, we will have one of these kinds of sessions where someone from outside of the immediate Wolfram Institute sphere comes and contributes with a talk. Sometimes these people might be coming from kind of our pipeline, so say summer school, winter school, or people who are directly related to the projects we do. Other times might be people who just happen to make contact with us because of scientific interactions. Other times, like today, we have someone who is a collaborator of a research fellow at the Institute. But generally, we want to create this deliberate effort to connect to the broader community and to have many different areas represented in this. So today, I'm very happy to welcome Liubov Tupikina. So she and I have been in contact for about a year and a half now, since we met in the Network Science International Conference back in 2023 in Vienna. And I was there as my first introduction to the community of higher order networks. So basically what has been the network science community in the last 30, 40 years, but now really almost taken over entirely by this whole higher order hypergraph techniques kind of angles and methods. So Liubov and I met there. We made interface on some of the mathematics, given our both interests in this sort of more purely mathematical topics. But today she brings this work that she's been doing also with a student of hers in Paris. And I'm looking forward to getting into it, hoping everyone enjoys the presentation. And we also have some time at the end for discussion. So please, Liubov, take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Carlos, and for the invitation, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at the Wolfram Institute, whose work we have been all following for quite some time now. And I guess I will need to share the slides, and you will be able to tell me if you see them or not. Okay, great. Yeah, 1 second. Yes, so what I will be presenting to you here is related to basically two main topics, and I thought that it would have been nice to indeed present it to you for several reasons. As Carlos mentioned, that it is related to the topic of high order structures in general and their reconstruction from data. This is the first topic that it will be related towards. And the second topic is related to the topic of embeddings. And we'll also talk about what embeddings are, but in general, these topics are very connected to what right now many people in AI communities are talking about. And as Carlos mentioned, it has been this topic of what I will be presenting to you today will be related to the work we have been doing with one of the person in the team of ours in France, in Bell Labs, but as well as we continued now as part of the joint collaboration and effort with St. Petersburg and with Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology. And actually, indeed, this journey started some time ago when we met at the NetSci conference, but then afterwards we had another event which I wanted to outline because James and I think also some of you also have been there. And if you haven't been, you should definitely watch it in the Wolfram Institute community. I don't have a link right now, but we can put it in the chat because it was a hypermetrics workshop, which was
the description as well later.
Great. Yes, thank you, James, for that, because it has been actually an opportunity to share with a new type of a community emerging around this topic, which is greatly advanced thanks to Wolfram Institute in general, because it's a community of people who are interested not just about in the topic of representing high order structures and studying high order structures from data, but also studying mathematical apparatus, which is developing for studying these structures. And partially, actually, there has been an effort, of course, put together by Wolfram Institute, but also largely I learned from these topics from Carlos, who has been very nicely introducing me and others also to these existing topics, research topics in the area. And partially one of the topics of my sabbatical year is actually also to try to connect the dots of studying this NRE algebraic structures and ways of encoding data in these NRE structures. For example, this one of the papers that I found, for example, in Lenin Library, were this papers which were unpublished or untranslated to some mathematical communities by from Wagner and from the collaborators from Maltsev algebras, and the way to using them in physics will be one way to actually continue and explore these topics. So one of the topics that we will be, and one of the questions that we will be trying to answer today will be how to encode embeddings from data using high order structures. For this, of course, we will need to actually understand what the embeddings are, and we will formalize them. But also we'll talk briefly, if we have a bit of time, about some algebraic constructions which can encode these high order structures. There were some other events apart from the hypermetrics workshops where we have been discussing that. Some of them, they were also in the Kudam Lab conference in Estonia, and you can also watch the recordings from there. And part of this work was presented also in the NetSci conference in Canada Online by Carlos. And there will be also more events coming, so if you want to learn about them, I will put the links also in the chat. And talking about this relation, why I'm presenting it here is, of course, related to this other, the research program at your institute, which I was really happy to learn about, and to learn about graph rewriting, which I will not talk about it here because I'm not working on that, but indeed I would like to invite those people who are watching this talk to look more at the links on this program, because it may be related to, for example, one of the topics that we encountered with my team when we started to deal with large graphs, with large hypergraphs, that it has been a big problem to work with them when we encode them or encode embeddings as hypergraphs, that we needed to parallelize our programs, and we needed to deal with a lot of computational problems as well. So maybe these topics that could be also of interest. Yeah, to look at. So after I present a bit more on the formalization, I will talk a bit more on the data structures, and then I will talk about specific applications to science of science data, from which actually this problem of the embeddings came from, for me at least, because I'm a mathematician by training, but I'm working in computer science lab where we encountered some issues where when we talk about embeddings, when we started to work with embeddings algorithms, and if you are a practitioner, what they call in computer science, when you're a practitioner, you go, if you want to work with some large or big amounts of data, quite often, if it's a textual data or if it's a data which is related to, for example, bioinformatics data, it can be data from pretty much everything, even video processed data. Right now, very important way to deal with this data is to try to embed it or to represent it as a lower, as a smaller representation, or like as a representative way to look at that. And one way to deal or to do with this data is to use embeddings algorithms. And if you search the first algorithms in GitHub, for example, and you go to some of these algorithms SDK and you try to read the documentation, then you will read that they use cosine similarities as comparing textual vectors of information, or they use some specific metrics, distance between the points, right? So these algorithms, they, as input, they get, for example, textual data, they process them into textual vectors, or they make them become points, right, which are having numerical representation in forms stored as vectors. And then you are obviously, what you want to ask is that, okay, how these two vectors will be closed, and by default, many of these algorithms, they have these settings. Of course, and actually that was one of the questions that we were asked also by the reviewers when we were working with these different data sets. You can always ask, right, what would be the drawbacks of choosing one of these measures or another, or is there a way to characterize why this measure or matrix will be chosen and what will be the inherited properties? Because inevitably, if you, for example, right now you train your LLM on a large amounts of data, right now very often what we actually see that instead of training your data or training your models on very large amounts of data, you can train your models on what they call curated data. And this curated data is actually precisely data which you can get from embedding your data into some lower dimensional. We didn't define yet what dimension is here, but we will talk about it soon. So that's why the relevance of this problem comes from this, the fact that people want to represent this large amounts of data, for example, textual data like Wikipedia data or other open data, as a kind of a smaller or low dimensional representation. And why I call about low dimensional, because in general, each vector can be, or each, for example, Wikipedia article or article from archive, if we talk about textual information, can be vectorized. You can, what they call in computer science, tokenize this information. Tokenization assumes that you are putting each or point, for example, your document, the correspondence, the coordinates, and each coordinate will be given assigned, right, dimension. So you will work in some, for example, high dimensional data sets. Usually it will be associated to some specific dimension which is related to this tokenization algorithm. And instead of working with 1,000-dimensional vector spaces, you want to come to small dimensional representation, right? So, and for example, here it's a map which you see, which appeared as part of this embedding algorithm that is representing already not that represents 1,000-dimensional data, but it kind of projects, right, or what they call in computer science uses dimensionality reduction algorithms to produce these maps. And the benefit of using these maps is not just from actually representing your data, as I said, in a human language, human eye language, human eye readable format, but it's also because, as we mentioned before, if we will give, for example, this information, for example, for LLMs to be trained on, we can use successfully some deduplication strategies and so on. So there is an evidence that it may be good to produce better algorithms for embeddings. But quite often, first of all, there are some drawbacks at these embedding algorithms. They are, first of all, they use metric spaces that are not really chosen by the necessity, but they are chosen just as a sort of by default. And often also there are some other issues that they are not explainable. So for example, two papers can be assigned together, and this was part of the work that we did together with Bunka Lab topics, where we put together, for example, assigned 2 points together if these two documents are related to each other. That was example of us working with textual data from archive, but more than saying that these two documents are indeed together, we couldn't really test it, right? Because we embedded, for example, all human knowledge gathered on archive, so around I think at that time around 1.5 million, but now it's up to already 4 million, I think, articles, and we cannot really assess, right, this information. We see that these documents seem to be related, but nothing more. And so this was one of the entry points why we started to get interested in the using higher order structures, because I promised you that I will talk, of course, first about formalization of embedding problem. And as I showed you, that the embedding problem was that even if we use what they call in computer science labeled datasets, so the labeled datasets are datasets where we have the information about not just the points that contain some information like documents, like articles. So each point here, it corresponds to the combination of scientific tags in archive dataset. And if these points or if two articles are related to each other, or their tags combination is close to each other, we put these papers together, and they are displayed together in this dimensional representation map. But what was more important and interesting in this dataset, why we started to work with that and arrived to some interesting seem to ask questions, was that embeddings were performing not so well for some specific areas. So when you construct and calculate what they call confusion metrics, some of the scientific areas are having lower ranks in the confusion metrics, which was quite actually explainable, because some of these areas, namely quantitative biology and statistics, were such areas that they are very, very known to be very interdisciplinary. And some areas which are interdisciplinary are obviously by these algorithms which are used by default, well, not obviously, but when we started to think about it, why they were performing so badly was partially because they are using graph-based or binary-based algorithms that are using graph or binary representation of data. I will talk about what do I mean by binary representation of data. but basically you would be using just graphical representation of your data. Then you would use and run algorithm that would work with a graphical representation of your data by default. And instead of using some more higher arity representation of your data. So we were trying to explain why these confusion matrix ranks were getting also very, giving us lower ranks. And also, as I mentioned to you, one other important, important for us question which we were asking was whether in using different metrics to characterize our distances in our manifold, by default was, for example, Euclidean distance, or if you would renormalize it, you could also choose other distances. So the question which we were asking there was whether that would be suitable to use cosine similarity or any other other distance, or whether there would be some pre-assigned pre-assigned metrics to use. But I mean by pre-assigned, like what would be the best one to start with, right? Because there are metrics learning algorithms that exist that we learned about later on that existed for starting to search for comparison, for example, of 2 points. And maybe a very important part here is that I wanted to show you the raw data, which we started to work with, which was this data from archive. So pretty much all the human science knowledge that would be presented. And actually, while working on this, we also saw some of the papers, for example, published on algorithms, state-of-the-art algorithms like TSNE or UMAP, which were also able to identify some of the papers, even using some simplistic, state-of-the-art, not simple, state-of-the-art algorithms like TSNE. They were able to identify papers which would be written by what they call windmills. These papers would be written by non-human generated language, non-human language by non-humans, and even these algorithms, right, that are comparing basically 2 papers just as a matter of tokenized, very kind of standard ways, were already able to detect that. That was kind of giving us also hope that even those algorithms are maybe not great, they're still able to identify some quite information. But coming back to our question on why these scores were so low, we wanted to try to understand maybe how first we could characterize accuracy of our embeddings at all, right? Because if you want to understand why some of the data points are misclassified because we have the information not just about text in the paper, but we also have information about to which sector it actually belongs, right? Characterized by experts who have written this paper. And one of the first way to characterize this accuracy would be, of course, to characterize accuracy of embeddings comparing the jump distances distributions from the embeddings. And what I mean by that is that we can compare just simply the distribution. So, for example, if you have one distribution calculated from your data points, right, and then you calculate pairwise distance distribution, and I'm showing you very numerical kind of results, but I hope still that they can be relevant for Wolfram community and for people working with Wolfram Mathematical also, because you can run these essentially functions and calculate them to compare whether changing parameters of your embeddings changes anything in the way how the embedding density, for example, distance distribution looks like, right? And we didn't see any of the differences. It was different parameterization of the method, which was kind of to be expected because essentially the idea, right, the whole core idea of the method was not changing. So we were not changing the fact that we were constructing these embedding algorithms using this binary representation of data. And that was only clear to us later on. And then what we also were looking at, and that was maybe something to mention later on, was that we also looked at the what we call observed versus random jump distance distribution, because what we were looking at initially at this data were trajectories of people who were moving from one area of science to another, because some of our trajectories in science, or in general our scientific endeavors, also can be considered as a trajectories in this high-dimensional knowledge space, right? That is basically very interesting and very different, and at the same time very similar to physical space, because actually the evidence that we have been gathering of studying how people are traveling from this knowledge graph is also the fact that actually you still can see this very resembling physical exploration of space probability density function that is constructed for the jump distance distribution that also is present when people are observing a physical space that is two-dimensional, right? That is basically the standard result, I would say, in stochastic processes theory when you study like random walk behavior, people who are random walks behavior, the exploration of space, the physical space, and here even exploring the more high-dimensional spaces such as knowledge graph. We were also still seeing the kind of this universal curves of the people exploring that. So different ways of exploring these embeddings were already very interesting for us. But actually, as I mentioned to you, at the core, this algorithm was using some assumption about our data, which was actually that was the representation of the data itself as a binary representation, and initial feature space was assumed also to be with some Euclidean metrics. And in general, these manifold learning algorithms, they are controlled mainly not by the data properties, but by some learning parameters, right? And Dima Kobak, who was writing many science papers on that, also were saying that actually with right initialization kernels for such methods, you would essentially get performance of these methods. Similarly, but it was very interesting for me personally to discover that whatever algorithm, right, of the manifold learning, what they also mention or call them, right, for reducing the dimension of your data, what they're using at their core is essentially the graphs. Graphical representation of the data, and then when you have learned your graph, then you are using some graph layout based type of algorithms that are representing or embedding this graph into some suitable representation, or putting together nodes that are similar together. And because of some known results in machine learning and state-of-the-art kind of theorems that say that whatever, if you give me a very, very general set of points and very general data, there will be no learning algorithm that will basically perform the best, right, on that. So we can't expect that from any set of data points that we will be able to design, and the algorithm that we will design will work. But nevertheless, right, what we noticed was that actually representing your data as a graph already affect or can affect, or it was more our assumption in that at that time, that representing our data at the first place not as a graph but as a hypergraph can actually support and test our hypothesis that that may be the reason why some of the accuracy of this method that I have shown you in the first place was low. Just because for some of the fields, scientific fields, which are, or some of the points that are related and that are connected to many, many other data points at the same time, that is actually may increase or explain why why this algorithm that are not performing as well. So and as a result, we tried to experiment with that and represent also as a hypergraph instead of a graph these structures, data structures that would have coordinates in the first place, and hence to be able to use this this very kind of the very core of the hypergraph kind of benefits, that is that it's, you can consider still it as a combinatorial object, but still try to use some of the benefits from inherited from being also closer to simplicial complexes, or right, which are related more to objects, which can be also considered more as a from topology perspective, and also represent and also use hypergraph measures, such as, for example, hypergraph motifs analysis to study the subcomponents of graphs, right? And the reason why we were spending this time on that was this recent also results with from the colleagues that we have been collaborating with, like the ones from Airy and from Charles de Dampierre, who also were saying that it's indeed very useful. It would be very interesting to look at this higher order representation of this data, because maybe then training the models on this well-created manifold data would increase the efficiency of such training, for example. To be able to show you the results, and I'm looking at the time, okay, have time. State-of-the-art algorithms for this, indeed, they were showing, they were using the graphical representation of the data. And for example, the graphical representation of the data in this case for our knowledge space reconstruction would be this graphical representation of, for example, two fields, which would be having some papers together between each other, and the weights of edges would be the weights which would be calculated as the proportion of papers published in this average by the total number of combinations of papers which would be existing in the whole archive, so that we would be getting something normalized. And this would be one way to represent our knowledge space. But as I mentioned, that some fields, they are not having this binary representation. And even in UMAP algorithm that is using this very beautiful, and mathematicians love this, for example, representations, and they love the ways, right, how this algorithm is, on what it is based on, such as, for example, the nerve theorem that would tell you that such a graphical representation of the data would still provide you some useful insight from the data. They still use the binary representation, so that's why instead of using this PIJ representation of the data, or connecting two points or two data points by one link, we were going into NRE links of representation, and that was something that allowed us to increase, of course, computational complexity of this hypergraph that we would be dealing with initially, to later on embed it. But we we're hoping that that would, at least this type of representation, would decrease some of the drawbacks of the graph representation. So I wrote here that Pij, right? So the probability of two nodes or two fields or two tags, in this case, to be connected, would be substituted by array hyperedge that would characterize each paper published or each combination of papers by the hyperedge. And this would be our main construct instead of this graph, right? That I showed you, that I showed you here, right? Instead of the graph, we would just have the graphical representation. And this graphical representation is a very hypergraphical representation of the data that is actually, by the way, generated by Carlos when we worked together on this with using Mathematica. So that was one of the way to also look at that representation. And I also like the way how you also may also from this, for example, graph, because it's very messy, right? So you can't really draw a lot of conclusions, but you already see that it has, if you are looking at, for example, papers representation from this way, it has a bit more information that you need kind of somehow to dissect and somehow to deal with. And because it is a more complex structure to work with, for example, encoding the data would be, as a hyperedge, would be that one paper which has 3 tags would be represented as a ternary edge. And if the paper is having 5 tags, that is often the case, that will be represented as 5 array edge, and so on, right? So it's kind of a natural representation of it. And as an encoding algorithm for our representation for our graph, right? So we start with our data, that is initial data that we have. Then we have a metadata for our data that we also can construct a hypergraph. And then if we want to compare our embedding method or embedding model between each other, we can compare, instead of comparing some machine learning based metrics like confusion metrics, we can also apply some hypergraph measures that are, for example, Motif analysis, to be able to characterize how well our embedding model is doing in capturing, for example, some of the metadata representation. So that was one of our ideas, but then we encountered some other problems to compare these hypergraphs between each other, because, as Carlos used to mention sometimes, was that actually mathematical frameworks that exist for dealing with the structures are not really often using some of the all full capabilities, mathematical capabilities of mathematical apparatus to be used to describe these structures, because very often we are using just a projected version of the structures to work with them. And instead of, for example, working with the whole complex representation of the hypergraph, we are working just with matrix representation or with projection, what they call, right? So we're using just a projection, a click projection or a line graph projection, because often tasks that we deal with also require these projections. So that's why we also in this task of comparing hypergraphs that would be representing different sides of the data from embedding model or from metadata model, we dealt with some problem essentially which would be translated into the algebraic type of problem that would be dealing with the graphical representation and hypergraphical representation which would be translated into algebraic structure. And here, actually, one of the way to encode these graphs as algebraic structures would be to represent this as an algebraic object. That was the case for a graph to be used to consider its set of vertices and set of edges, which would then be representing the edges as the linear operators, which would satisfy some certain properties that we obey them to explore. But essentially, a very important point of these properties would be that A would be coming into B, and B would be becoming A if they are connected, and if C is not connected to B, that would be 0. So such kind of points and operators would be some parts of way to encode these graphs into algebraic structures. And as I mentioned to you, that the natural way to extend that and to continue would be to actually to represent and to generalize this structure in the case of hypergraphs and consider this kind of ternary versions of that. Why it's important, and I think that maybe research and what Carlos had been mentioning also with Bhattacharya-Massner product and related structures of explaining some of these non-associative structures properties are deeply related to the more algebraic, that can be translated into algebraic language problems that are related to the fact that when we are dealing with hypergraphs, some of these binary related structures that have very clearly understood, or not very maybe easy to understand, but some already understood properties, they are not really directly translated into the case of ternary structures. So for example, even if we want to define these algebras for the case of hypergraphs, we needed to, for example, deal with enumerization problem that we don't have in the case of graphs. So for example, when we want to define these algebras, we had to first say that this algebra definition would not depend on the enumerization counterclockwise problem for defining these hyperedges, for example, if they would be or not would be connected or related to the fact that we are setting up the direction of vertices, because that would be ill-defined mathematical object. And so in general, this problem of defining these objects and identifying, I don't know why it's blurred, but yeah, defining this algebraic object would be an additional subpart which would assist us with creation or following the algebraic structures as an object that would assist our work with hypergraphs in general. And because I mentioned to you already this kind of excursion to the small algebraic structures part of thing, it's related to studying in general general properties which people have been encountering when working with hypergraphs. And in general, studying hypergraphs is have been shown also to be very effective when we study some of the motifs structures for such complex structures. And because of the these motifs, for example, like in this area, can kind of try to help us to dissect our complex hypergraph structure, we wanted to also apply that further on, this knowledge and also the knowledge which we get from general hypergraph properties, that we wanted to apply to study the embeddings and hypergraph representation of these embeddings. And that was one of the parts that we applied also for the case for our hypergraph structures, that we looked at some of these parts that, I mean, the motivation to use this embeddings dissection method using the motifs analysis was essentially also suggested by Carlos when he suggested also to use and to look at some of the subparts of the to look at the very popular motifs substructures in our hypergraphs that would be more present in some of the subparts of the hypergraphs than others. And what we saw was that in the misclassified clusters of our data, the motifs which would be more highlighted as a high order motifs were more present than others, which was again suggesting us that using this high order representation of this data, especially that is having many high order links and connections, is very vital, right? Again, I wanted just to highlight that these further directions, because I don't want to go too much over time, that I mentioned to you was this work on the isomorphism problems for hypergraphs, because this graphical representation and hypergraph representation problems, that they're related to the isomorphism problems that we can work with using the algebraic theory, for example, the one which I showed you from Liubov and Costa, which assumes that this hypergraph algebras, like in the case of graph algebras, they are fully defining the structures of hypergraphs. So with this, maybe I wanted to conclude to be able to maybe discuss more. So this is something that is very interesting for me personally to learn more from your institute, these hypergraphs, isomorphism related problems that Carlos showed us, also directions that more related to the heaps and studying the associativity properties that may be related also to study this more embeddings types of encoded structures. In general, comparison of latent space of models also can be really useful and interesting to apply further the high order structures towards dissecting these models and what their output is. I can also put the link to the chat because we're also trying to redesign some of these embedding algorithms using the hypergraph representation. And hypergraphs, for example, distances defined differently, right, than you define in the graphical structures. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the next versions of the hypermetrics workshops. I hope that there will be some in the future. In MIPT, we are also trying to redesign a course on embeddings and hypergraphs, because there are some experts who are more like in Regorovsky team, who work more with the simplicial complexes side of things and Borsuk-Ulam methods, and combining that together may also lead to some interesting new areas emerging. In Paris, we also have soon embedding days coming in hybrid mode, so we will be happy to invite you as well here. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me on this email. And yeah, thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Liubov. Thanks for the presentation. So we do have some time for comments and questions. Do you guys have any questions, any curiosities, any things to ask Liubov?
Well, can we just clarify how this embedding business works in general? So you have like a bunch of papers, like to each of the papers you assign like a hyperedge, right? And
yeah,
basically construct a hypergraph. Then
actually, sorry, Nick, you said you are talking about the state-of-the-art methods, or you're talking about new type of methods? Because the state-of-the-art methods, they usually use the graphical representation, right? They don't use hypergraph as the way to design this method. So let me go back to this, right? So as state-of-the-art, they use this representation, right? So you have the bunch of papers, right? each paper has coordinates or has words. You can vectorize this, and then you are having assessment.
By words, you mean like fields or keywords? What kind of words?
Yeah, it can be if you have a metadata like keywords, it can be keywords. For example, you can numerize them immediately then from 0 to 100, for example, right? And then you have coordinates which are directly translated as like if you have two coordinates like mathematics and physics, it will be coordinate 1 and 1, and mathematics, computer science 1, 0, 1, and so on. You can kind of having the distance would be the distance between two papers in this case, right? So I can maybe draw it or write it down, but yeah. So if you have coordinates, like for example, this line would be all zeros, right? And this will be 0, 0, 1, 1 because it's these two papers, right, would be corresponding to two different scientific fields. So these two scientific fields would be non-zero in these coordinates. It's one way to encode it, right? So the problem is that encoding also affects the way how you embed the information and how you deal with that. But one way to encode it would be to
But this is good. This happens after you construct the graphical structure, the graph, right?
Yes. So, but the graph you construct from you construct it afterwards, after you embed it, or sorry, after you encode this into the vector representation. But as people have shown, actually, the way you tokenize information can also affect your embedding, right? Because if you are embedding your data, if you are tokenizing your data in one way, for example, by assessing or making correspondence as a vector of zeros and ones, or you are using some more sophisticated encoding, it's very easy to show that you may get two different graphs depending on, right, which measures will you use or which threshold you will use, right, by representing closeness of 2 points, right? You can use. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Dugan, are you muted perhaps on OBS? I don't think the audience can hear you.
We can, but the live stream, I think, no.
Yeah, that sometimes happens.
Sorry about that.
Mm-hmm.
We had some questions here about if HPUs are going to be the new thing after GPUs and TPUs, hypergraph processing units. Sorry to distract.
Wait, I need to see those questions.
What is the question? Is it related to Nick's question or to Dugan's comments or?
It's
no, not
Dugan's
Dugan's comments.
I gave at Bell Labs.
All right,
Oh my God.
I think
Okay.
that should be good. I think I'm coming through online now.
Okay. No, but the comments, just to come back for a second to initial question from Nick, which is actually indeed what I should have maybe explained a bit more in the beginning, because indeed when we start with these data in general, right, the data points can be either represented as set of tags, right, which is more coarse-grained, as Dugan said, way to represent your information, or you can start with the text itself, like full text of the article, for example. And if it's a full text of the article, you can represent it as a set of tags, text, like a textual information that by default you tokenize the algorithm, that you can look at BERT-like algorithms that will provide you, like, indeed the tokens, right? Like usually of 1,000 dimensions, right?
Any LLM nowadays can vectorize a large amount of text. Just
yes.
figure. Yep.
Yeah, but then when you tokenize it, and you kind of, people usually say, oh, okay, I'm getting a vector, right, as an input. So great, so I can work with the vectors that I learned at school, right? So let's, like, you know, work with these vectors, and we will get a beautiful manifold to then later on to look at. But the question is what you exactly getting as an output of this vectorization, and what because as I mentioned to you, this distance metric learning algorithm that proposing, like, this matrix that we are getting as a structure on the input, they will be inherited by our manifold, and then what we will that will get out the output of this algorithm, of the embedding algorithm, will be also inherited by, for example, retrained models on this manifolds. So it's kind of, it was interesting for us to see that even though this embedding algorithm, that they are not well performing, right, we still by default using them, right? And the reason why we wanted to look at what were those papers, or sorry, yeah, the data on which they were performing much worse. And we found out that these were those papers which were participating in this high ORT motifs, like this kind of the most interdisciplinary areas. So they were corresponding to data points which were not binary essentially, but high arity papers. That was one.
Can I try to try to summarize this problem with manifolds and metric learning? It's basically like goes like because you have a high dimensional embedding of your article, you have a vector, but you don't know which manifold it actually belongs to, right? But you don't have a metric of how to compute the distance in that space. You just have a vector, and it's a problem of actually learning the metric from the data and from the embedding that you just learned. Even you used some powerful neural network to actually embed the data, right? To actually learn how to efficiently and meaningfully compute the metrics and distances between the points in that space, you have to do some additional metric learning, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, if you just use some standard Euclidean cosine similarity things, you will get some bad results.
Yeah. Yes. And precisely for that, thank you, Nick, for the comment, because of that, actually, you can also try to pause for a second your matrix learning algorithm and say that you can also deal with this problem more as a combinatorial object, right? A combinatorial problem. So you can actually look at that from hypergraph motifs perspective and say that you will not learn any matrix right now. You will more assess your data structure as a higher or arity data structure, so a hypergraph essentially, or knowledge hypergraph, that will, of course, we also can impose some metric, and even if it's weighted hypergraph, we can impose some metric and we'll test it. But essentially what was one of the main points was that actually maybe we don't need to solve this problem of matrix choice, right? We may actually also try to pose it and deal with some of the hypergraph representation and study it from this perspective. But it's, again, as I said, that it's work in progress. We need to work more on that, understand and test it on different, more kind of curated setup. We don't want to test it on benchmarks. We want first to understand the core of it, and then it's just a side.
Just as curiosity, which kind of algorithms you used for the metric learning? I remember there was a bunch. Like back in the day, I used some Python library for metric learning, and it was like a dozen of algorithms to learn.
Yeah, so actually for metric learning, directly here, for example, in TMO, there is a person who was suggesting some of these papers to look at them, because we're still working on them, and they were using Sobolev spaces as kind of the most general ways and spaces to start with. So you're not starting with your assumption that you are already having Euclidean metric, but you kind of want to start with some very general setup. And essentially, when you are, I'm not sure whether they are the most efficient ones, but you want kind of to have the least possible limitations of your metrics, for example, or comparison of these points. But I need to look it up back, because essentially what we were doing, we were trying to get rid of this, right? Because it was a very challenging part, and you're right, Nick, that there are a lot of algorithms, right? And every day maybe there is a new algorithm that is beating the previous ones. So we wanted more to actually use more combinatorial combinatorial approach to that, and not to initially design them. Yeah.
What exactly do you mean, like, by using combinatorial? Because it's like, what comes as an input to metric learning algorithm is just a set of distances, right? You just have a bunch of points, and you only know how to compute those distances. You can compute them from the hypergraph, and you want to learn the matrix.
Yeah, and also and actually you have, sorry, I interrupted you.
No.
Yes. So, and actually, if you have also some of the information, usually you have the information from the 2 points that indeed they are somehow, you have coordinates, you have 2 points that have coordinates, and you want to assess the closeness. You want to assess the whole. You want to assess the metrics that would be the most suitable, right? But you need to optimize what would be the most that would be what you will be optimizing it for, right? So what we tried to work with, and as I showed you here, for example, was that there would be 2 types of for example, distances that we would be testing. And one way to also look at this metrics optimized type of algorithms would be to say that we would be comparing the distance distributions that for different types of metrics, which we would be trying. So you can kind of do try and test all types of possible metrics. For example, Manhattan distance metrics and whatever representations. So but as I mentioned to you, that by combinatorial, what I meant was more trying approaches where we don't need to start with assumption of the metrics existing in our data, or like some kind of the most natural metrics, but to try to look at and to work with this data as the hypergraph, and then, for example, study motifs as ways to dissect, or like enumerated motifs as a way to dissect these embeddings and data representation. I'm not saying that this is maybe the best way to say it, because when people hear about combinatorial, they mean very specific methods, right? So maybe I need to rename it by calling it maybe motif, right, analysis, that you call it this way, right, also in Wolfram community.
Right.
Okay. Any other questions here? Do we?
I don't know if Dugan wants to have another go at these.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah.
so you do you use a LLM to make the matrix embedding for each paper, or is it based on a certain number of tags?
Yes, so maybe I was a bit quick indeed here to show it. Essentially, we were using different type of representation of our data. Indeed, we were using some of the BERT type of models. So BERT is one of those models which was quite already now old, but is still quite quite known and widely used model for embedding your textual data. Then as an output, you get 1024 dimensional output and vector, dimension of which is really much higher. Then you either can construct a hypergraph from those vectors based on the, for example, the fact that these points are close or that they are related towards because of the topics.
So do they do you measure their angle as vectors, or do you measure their distance as points?
Yes, so we, as I was showing before, indeed we were using both actually, the angles and also the distances, like the Euclidean distances. But the problem here was that when you are using this representation of BERT model, as vectors, you're already kind of getting into this game, what Nick was mentioning, that you need to apply here kind of matrix learning algorithms, because you need to learn and compare 2 points already, like you're already, like these models, they already by default in their intestine, you already have they're already giving you the vectors as an output, and so in this specific paper we wanted to characterize how by comparing it with the metadata or with the kind of what they call ground truths, we wanted to compare and see how badly actually these models are doing. And what we saw that these models, precisely as we expected, they were doing not as well on precisely these higher order structures tags. So,
is that they're so you have this categorization in the metadata, and then you were saying, okay, well, so if you have all this dimension, the vectors give you a metric for which ones are nearby each other, essentially, and then you're seeing what the clustering looks like, and you're checking
exactly
that against the metadata.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Because we wanted to try to come up with some of the ways to characterize how well, some of these models were doing. By the one way of characterizing that is by looking at the clusters of the information that they are classifying. So it's kind of classification tasks that we are giving, and characterizing this bidirectional encoder representation, that BERT is basically bidirectional encoder architecture. We again saw that even without knowing how this bidirectional encoder works, you can still see the inherited kind of structures from what we also observed data, that some of these embeddings, they were not doing well on some higher rarity data points. So data points that participate typically in more than 3 tags. So
like physics did well because the physics papers all just kind of clustered together in one big lump, it seems.
Exactly.
And then the other subjects didn't cluster so well because there were sublumps that didn't have any crosstalk.
Yes.
So it's like you could subdivide those even further if you wanted to suss out which ones are different subcategories. or
Yeah, so
unrelated?
I didn't, yeah, yes, thanks, Dugan. So I didn't put this plot indeed here, but we did calculate that was critical later on was that we were trying also to characterize arity of the different fields, because physics papers, they have subcategories that are, right, physics, like physics, astronomy, physics, condensed matter, and so on. But actually, we were looking at the arity in respect to kind of saying that, oh, there would be like quantitative biology uses a lot of computer science, for example, and statistics, while physics still generally on average, for some reason, right, is indeed clusters a bit more. So it's a general observation for this data, but not necessarily, right? For example, for gene expression data, it's also very typically related to the structures that gene expression data also is like very often genes, for example, expressed only right when you are, yeah, there is combination like 3 or 4, right? And here, yeah, it was also an important thing that for many papers, they were not only 2 or of them together, but 4, yeah.
And for the you're talking about how some authors would drift through different categories. Is that like you take the list of the papers that they write and then you see what their embeddings are?
So wait, did you mean the drift? What did
The
you mean the
drift,
drift
yeah,
like,
the academic
yes,
drift.
so like these ones, or like the kind of temporal representation, I mean, or what do you mean by drift?
I guess you're describing some sort of drifting between subjects, and I was wondering what that meant.
Yes, yes, okay. So by this you mean, right? Or this representation, or because that was actually previously previous research that was done more for different reason, because obviously areas of science are moving and changing every year, so we can't expect that obviously this assignment of tags also is right, will be the same for all set of all times. So actually what we were also observing was that in this community of embedding community, there are no measures, at least known to me. Maybe some people would point me out that I'm wrong. I would be happy to learn about that. That's even in UMAP temporal embedding representation of space, for example, there are really not many algorithms that I know of that would be able to capture the by time window kind of natural analysis of representing this changing changing knowledge space, right? Because some tags get outdated and some tags are never used again, like for example high energy physics or some of this naturally dying kind of area, but actually some of them that are like computer science now are striving for different reasons, right? So how to account for that in our kind of knowledge hypergraph representation, and how to construct the most relevant kind of methods also for capturing this temporal aspects of embeddings, it's yet another topic. And maybe it can be a topic of yet another talk to speak here.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting analysis that can be done on this type of stuff. I mean, for instance, if you want to, you can take authors, a single like author, right, and you can track their history in this graph with their papers, and then see like, oh, they started in computational biology, then sort of drifted into this subject, and then drifted into that adjacent subject, and then you could aggregate all this flowing and kind of get a sense about what areas of research are sort of valent to other areas of research, as sort of feeding into or something like that. So you kind of have a flow diagram.
Yeah.
And just thinking
And
outside the box, sorry, it's also possible to track individual little bits of data or little ideas. And see how those flow through different papers.
Yeah, so there is James Evans' group in the Georgia Tech, I think. I can put it also in the chat, who worked a lot on this topic. They worked what they call hypergraphs embeddings, but a bit more from different perspectives, because they were more interested in the science of science type of side of works. And James Evans from Georgia Tech, and they were working on, for example, specifically looking at the representation of this knowledge of ideas, right? So more on the cross-grained level than tags. And their work is great. They were, however, driven by another research question, applying the hypergraphs there, because they were really interested in indeed this drifting of ideas, and saying, for example, of how this hypergraph representation can be also more cross-grained representation of the data, right? Which was obviously obvious in the case that it gives you more perspective. But for us, it was very important to understand how we can assess embedding models using the hypergraph representations, because quite often what I see in the talks in computer science, when you assess your embeddings, you are like, okay, this is the confusion matrix, this is very bad, bye. So, you know, like there is no continuation of why whatsoever, why these models don't perform well on some data, and why on some data they perform correctly, like well. And I'm not saying that we answered the question, but we try to dissect this question of why on some areas, right, they do perform really poorly. And it seems to be correlated, let's put it this way, right, with the hierarchy present motifs, and on testing it on random data and comparing it with other existing algorithms may help to dissect that. Indeed, Dugan, as you said, there are more questions here than answers to our knowledge. So if you know good algorithms, by the way, maybe I could ask a question about the hypergraphs embedding algorithms, if maybe Nick or Dugan, you worked with any of them in your research, or if you encountered any of them.
So yeah, let's use the final minutes to bring some of the audience questions, because I think there were a couple comments that were interesting. So let me see. There was a question just now from WWKK. So we can compare the hypergraphs based on learned embeddings. Probably larger models would like models like O1 would produce better basis vectors and hence better hypergraphs. If it can be shown that learning tokenization schemes combinatorially is equivalent to metric learning, then that solves the problem. So that's a question / comment from YouTube.
Yeah, and I mean, actually, it's I should have brought other colleague who worked precisely on this metrics learning algorithm, because I'm not an expert at all on this, and I try to work on more on the hypergraph motifs and hypergraph encoding part of side. But I did want to acknowledge the existing science of this metrics learning algorithm that may be already actually have been exploring this side of things a lot more. Yeah, so it's important to acknowledge the fact that they do have progress, right? And I don't want to mention that they don't have any results, or they don't have answer to this problem, because the beauty of this problem of embeddings and characterizing the kind of inaccuracy of them is precisely that actually there is no one answer to this question, that it seems. That's like there is no one only one matrix that is characterizing that. Yeah.
Great. That was a great
Alright.
talk. Thanks, Liubov.
Yeah, thank you very much, Liubov, for
You.
great talk. So I think that's gonna do it for today. We had our first branded Wolfram Institute seminar. I want to reemphasize that we are simply just making more of a statement about what to expect from us. We love to bringing researchers with fascinating areas of work, such as Liubov here with us today, and do expect it more in the future. I mean, that's what we are here for. And apart from all our work in the science, we love to communicate it, bring it out in the world. So for all you watching that haven't joined our community, you can follow the link that I am going to post from my personal account. You can, maybe Dugan can also post it. It's basically just our website, very easy to find, wolframinstitute.org. And you go to the community tab and you will see links to join the Discord and you join the mailing list. So we have an active community over there. People are discussing all aspects of Wolfram orbiting topics, and of course the ones that we regularly work on, such as infogeometry and the blog posts from Stephen and all the quantum framework that Nick is doing, etc. So it's a pleasure. As I said, it's great to have now this branded and to have Liubov sort of have kind of open the season for the seminar titled now a series of streams. And with that, I'll see you in the next seminar.
Thanks
Bye,
again.
guys.
See you, everyone.
A lot.